A weathered journal discovered in 2023 during the renovation of an antebellum mansion in rural Georgia contains meticulous records of crop yields, livestock management, and, most disturbingly, detailed anatomical drawings of human digestive systems alongside recipes written in a cryptic shorthand. Archaeological excavations of the property would later uncover a disturbing pattern of human bone fragments mixed with animal remains in what was once a smokehouse. If you think you can stomach what comes next, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because this forgotten chapter of American history has remained buried for a reason, and some will wish it had stayed that way. In March of 2023, contractor Wesley Daniels was overseeing the renovation of the Thornwell estate, a pre-Civil War property purchased by a wealthy Atlanta family as a weekend retreat. What began as a routine examination of the foundation quickly evolved into something far more disturbing. We found the first journal when we were checking the integrity of the library floorboards, Daniels would later tell investigators. It was sealed in a metal box inside a cavity in the wall. I thought we'd found Confederate gold or something. Wish to God that's all it had been. The journal belonged to Elias Thornwell, the property's original owner and, according to county records, a respected farmer known for his agricultural innovations and community leadership. But the contents of that journal, and the 5 others subsequently discovered behind a false wall in the root cellar, revealed a man whose ambitions extended far beyond conventional farming. When the Georgia Historical Society began a formal excavation of the property 3 months later, they uncovered a modified smokehouse with unusual drainage systems and a hidden subfloor chamber. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, the forensic anthropologist who led the excavation, described their findings. The soil composition was unusual, extraordinarily rich in organic material. Initial analysis indicated a mixture of animal and human remains, broken down to a degree that suggested deliberate processing rather than simple burial. The bone fragments we recovered showed distinctive markings consistent with butchering techniques common to the mid-19th century. Join us as we unravel the forgotten story of Elias Thornwell, a man whose legendary hospitality concealed one of the most methodical campaigns of quiet horror in pre-Civil War Georgia. A truth deliberately stricken from county records and passed down only as fragmentary warnings. Never eat what Thornwell grows. This investigation draws on sources long thought lost: private correspondence, medical records, church documents, and oral histories passed down through generations of local families, many of whom still refuse to speak Thornwell's name aloud. We've pieced together a narrative that challenges our understanding of antebellum Southern society and reveals how easily atrocity can hide behind the veil of community respect and economic success. To understand how Thornwell's particular brand of horror could flourish undetected, we must first understand the world in which he operated. In 1859, Georgia stood at a precarious moment in history. The tensions that would erupt into civil war the following year were already simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. The plantation economy was at its peak, with cotton and tobacco generating unprecedented wealth for white landowners, while the enslaved population that made this prosperity possible lived in conditions of escalating brutality. Rural communities like Thornwell's operated with significant autonomy. Local law enforcement was minimal, and county officials were often the same men who owned the largest properties. Community standing depended on a complex calculus of wealth, family connections, and perceived moral character, particularly as demonstrated through Christian piety and hospitality. This last element, hospitality, held particular significance in Southern culture. The sharing of food was not merely a social nicety, but a moral obligation and public demonstration of one's character. A farmer who generously shared his harvest earned community respect that translated into political influence, favorable business arrangements, and social standing for his family. It was a time of limited medical knowledge, particularly regarding nutrition and digestion. Folk remedies passed down through generations held equal or greater sway than formal medical advice, which itself was often based on outdated or incorrect assumptions about human physiology. Food preservation techniques were primitive by modern standards, and unexplained illnesses following communal meals were common enough not to arouse immediate suspicion. Agricultural experimentation was widely practiced and encouraged. Farmers regularly exchanged seeds, growing techniques, and fertilizer formulations. Those who developed methods resulting in larger harvests or more resistant crops were celebrated as innovators and sought after for advice. It was in this context that Elias Thornwell established himself as one of Crawford County's most respected citizens, a reputation he would leverage to conduct experiments of unimaginable depravity, not in the soil of his fields, but in the bodies of his trusting neighbors. In a county where most farmers struggled to feed their families through harsh seasons, Elias Thornwell's crops flourished year-round, seemingly immune to drought and blight. His agricultural journal, now preserved in the Georgia Historical Society's restricted collection, contains a chilling entry from May 1858. The human vessel, properly prepared, yields nutrients superior to any soil. This is just the beginning of what we've uncovered, and why this series has been the subject of attempted suppression since we began our research. Elias Thornwell was not born to wealth or privilege. The third son of a middling tobacco farmer, he displayed an unusual aptitude for botany and chemistry that caught the attention of a visiting landowner with connections to Edinburgh University. Through this patron's influence, young Thornwell was sent to Scotland in 1839 at the age of 19 to study agricultural science, an extraordinary opportunity for someone of his background. University records indicate that Thornwell was a dedicated, if somewhat solitary student who spent more time in the experimental gardens and anatomical theater than socializing with his peers. His professors noted his particular interest in parasitology and symbiotic relationships in plant systems, interests that, in retrospect, foreshadowed his later preoccupations. In 1845, Thornwell married Catherine Dunbar, the daughter of a Scottish physician specializing in digestive disorders. Their union lasted only 3 years before Catherine's death from what was recorded as a wasting illness of unknown origin. No autopsy was performed, and Thornwell had her body returned to Georgia with unusual haste. Thornwell returned to Crawford County in the autumn of 1848, bringing with him not only his wife's remains, but numerous trunks of scientific equipment, botanical specimens, and journals from his European studies. Using a modest inheritance from Catherine's estate, he purchased a 100-acre property 10 miles outside the county seat and began establishing what would become known locally as Thornwell's Providence, a farm renowned for its consistent yields, regardless of weather conditions that plagued neighboring properties. Eyewitness accounts describe Thornwell as a man of lean but powerful build, standing just under 6 feet tall, with prematurely gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person. Always immaculately dressed despite the nature of his work, he was particularly noted for his hands, strong, calloused from farm labor, yet meticulously clean, with nails trimmed short and buffed. Martha Collins, whose great-grandmother was a frequent guest at Thornwell's table, preserved this description in her family memoir. Mr. Thornwell kept himself unlike any farmer I've known. Mother said his fingernails never showed a speck of the soil he worked, though his hands were strong enough to snap a fence post. He smiled readily but never widely, as if holding something back. His eyes were the color of storm clouds and just as changeable. He had a way of watching people eat that made Mother uncomfortable, though she could never explain exactly why. Thornwell's property featured several unusual architectural elements that raise few questions at the time, but take on sinister significance in light of what we now know. His root cellar was exceptionally large and divided into climate-controlled sections, an innovation he claimed to have brought from Europe. The smokehouse was positioned not at the conventional distance from the main house, but connected by a covered walkway that allowed access regardless of weather conditions. Most notably, he maintained a separate structure he called his laboratory, a small building where he claimed to develop fertilizer formulations and test soil samples. Few neighbors were ever invited inside this building, though several accounts mention the distinctive smells that emanated from it, simultaneously sweet and putrid, like fruit rotting in summer heat. From county records and business ledgers, we know that Thornwell made frequent trips to Savannah to acquire specialized equipment, ostensibly for agricultural experiments, but now recognizable as modified surgical instruments. He also maintained regular correspondence with medical supply companies in Philadelphia and London, ordering substances that had no conventional agricultural application, but significant uses in human surgery and preservation. The public face of Elias Thornwell was carefully cultivated. He attended church regularly, though not ostentatiously, made modest but consistent donations to community causes, and participated in county agricultural fairs where his produce regularly won prizes. He was known to provide food to families struggling after poor harvests, and his seasonal feasts became community institutions. One surviving invitation to his 1857 harvest dinner reads, "Mr. Elias Thornwell requests the pleasure of your company for a meal celebrating God's bounty on the third Saturday of October. Special dishes prepared from his newest cultivars will be served. Your presence would be a blessing." Behind this facade of Christian charity and community spirit, however, Thornwell pursued interests of a far darker nature, interests suggested by the private journals now in the possession of researchers. These writings reveal a man obsessed with what he termed internal cultivation, the deliberate introduction of certain organisms into the human digestive tract to enhance nutrient absorption and, most disturbingly, to create self-perpetuating colonies that could be partially harvested without killing the host. Dr. Marion Lewis, medical historian at Emory University, explains, Thornwell's journals show that he conceptualized the human body as a type of living soil that could be seeded, cultivated, and harvested. His European education had exposed him to early theories about intestinal flora and parasitic relationships. But he took these ideas in directions that no legitimate scientist would have contemplated. He wasn't just studying these relationships, he was engineering them for specific purposes. Several key figures in the community had significant interactions with Thornwell, and their accounts provide crucial perspectives on his activities. Dr. Samuel Wainwright served as the county's primary physician, a position of considerable influence but limited medical resources. His private correspondence reveals a man increasingly dependent on Thornwell for certain medicinal herbs that prove remarkably effective in treating common ailments, even as he harbored growing suspicions about their source and composition. In a letter to his brother in Charleston dated December 1856, Wainwright wrote, "Thornwell's preparations work like nothing I've encountered in 20 years of practice. The digestive tonic in particular produces effects that border on the miraculous. Patients near death with wasting illnesses show remarkable improvement within days. He refuses to share his formulation, claiming family secrets brought from the old country. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of administering substances I do not fully understand because I cannot deny their efficacy." Sheriff Josiah Mercer maintained law and order in Crawford County from 1851 until his death in early 1859. County records show that he was a frequent dinner guest at Thornwell Farm and received regular gifts of appreciation in the form of preserved meats and vegetables. Medical records preserved in his widow's papers document a puzzling decline in his health during the last year of his life, periods of extraordinary vigor followed by increasing lethargy and unexplained internal pain. Abigail Foster, a widow who owned the neighboring property, represents one of the few voices of consistent suspicion regarding Thornwell's activities. Her diaries, discovered in her granddaughter's attic in 1971, but only recently connected to the Thornwell case, document unusual activities observed through her bedroom window, which faced Thornwell's smokehouse. Again tonight, the lights in the smokehouse burned until dawn, the third night this week. I observed T. making multiple trips from the laboratory carrying covered buckets. Twice he emerged with what appeared to be soiled linens. The sounds that sometimes emerge from that building are not those of animal slaughter. I have heard enough pigs butchered to know the difference between an animal's death cry and a human's. Perhaps most telling are the fragmented accounts of Solomon, an enslaved man who worked Thornwell's fields. Unlike most enslaved people in the region, Solomon and the 4 others owned by Thornwell were strictly forbidden from consuming any food grown on the property, an unusual prohibition that Thornwell explained to neighbors as a necessary discipline. Historical researchers have found evidence in church records that Solomon attempted to warn a newly arrived family about Thornwell's food, leading to a severe punishment for spreading lies about his master. The Baptist Minister's Journal notes, "The slave Solomon was brought before the congregation to confess the sin of bearing false witness, having told the Wilson family that Master Thornwell's food has teeth inside that bite from within. He received 30 lashes for this blasphemy against a Christian neighbor's charity. Mr. Thornwell, in his mercy, permitted the punishment rather than selling this troublesome soul away from his family. An 1857 letter from Dr. Samuel Wainwright to a medical colleague in Charleston, recently discovered in a university archive, notes, "The peculiar ailments affecting our county defy classification. Patients report unusual movements in their digestive tracts, followed by periods of extraordinary vitality, then rapid decline. All share one commonality. They have supped regularly at Thornwell's table." What Dr. Wainwright would discover next was so disturbing that he burned his own medical journals, but not before making a copy that would remain sealed until our investigation. As early as 1853, subtle patterns began to emerge in the health and behavior of those who regularly consumed Thornwell's food. Initial effects appeared entirely positive: increased energy, improved complexion, and resistance to common seasonal illnesses that affected other community members. Several accounts mention the distinctive robust quality of families who regularly attended Thornwell's community feasts or received his charitable food contributions. Melissa Harrison, age 34, wrote to her sister in Atlanta, "Since we began receiving Mr. Thornwell's weekly basket, Thomas has not lost a single day of work to his usual winter cough. The children's cheeks glow with health, and I myself have never felt more energetic. His vegetables have a distinctive sweetness unlike any I've tasted, and his preserved meats are so tender they nearly melt on the tongue. We count ourselves blessed to be in his generosity's path." However, these periods of unusual vitality were typically followed by more troubling symptoms: unexplained abdominal pain, distended stomachs, nocturnal restlessness, and eventually a profound lethargy that Dr. Wainwright's treatments could temporarily alleviate but never cure. Most disturbing were reports of movement sensations described variously as fluttering, crawling, or something turning over within the abdominal cavity. Martha Simmons reported to Dr. Wainwright, "It feels as though something is swimming inside me, doctor. At night when I lie still, I can feel it moving from one side to the other. Thomas says I'm imagining things, but last week he woke in the night clutching his own stomach, swearing he could feel something pushing against his hand from the inside." Another cause for growing unease was the distinctive quality of Thornwell's meat products. Despite maintaining a relatively small livestock operation, records show he never owned more than 8 pigs and a dozen chickens at any time, Thornwell consistently provided large quantities of preserved meats to the community, particularly after poor hunting seasons when other protein sources were scarce. These meats were noted for their unusual appearance and taste. Surviving descriptions mention a marbled quality unlike conventional pork and a distinctive sweetness that made other meats seem bland by comparison. Several accounts note the unusual tenderness that allowed the meat to be consumed with minimal chewing, a quality that takes on disturbing significance in light of what we now understand about Thornwell's cultivation methods. Between 1851 and 1858, county records document 17 cases of travelers who were last seen on the road bordering Thornwell's property. While disappearances were not uncommon in rural areas during this period, the concentration around this particular location represents a statistical anomaly that went uninvestigated at the time. Sheriff Mercer's official reports attributed most of these disappearances to likely continuation of journey without local notification or probable wildlife attack, though no evidence supported either conclusion. Notably, Thornwell himself reported several of these disappearances, always a day or more after the travelers would have passed his property, and always volunteered to join search parties, which invariably found no trace of the missing persons. Dr. Wainwright's growing concerns are documented in his private medical journal, where clinical observations gradually give way to more troubling speculations. February 3, 1856. The Harrison boy presents with the same symptoms I've observed in a dozen patients now, all regular consumers of Thornwell's produce. The abdominal distension defies conventional diagnosis. When pressed in certain locations, the stomach wall appears to react with independent movement, as if something within is recoiling from the pressure. I've observed no parasite that behaves in this manner, yet I can conceive of no other explanation. March 17, 1856. Performed my first post-mortem examination of a victim of this strange ailment, Sarah Collins, age 42, who succumbed after 3 months of progressive symptoms. What I discovered in her digestive tract cannot be explained by any medical literature available to me. The intestinal walls contained what appeared to be secondary structures, growths with their own rudimentary circulatory systems embedded within the patient's tissues. Most disturbing, these structures appeared to have been partially removed multiple times, with evidence of regeneration. It was as if something had been harvested from the living body. Further cause for suspicion came from the unusual modifications Thornwell made to his smokehouse. Modifications that architectural historians now recognize as designed for purposes far removed from conventional meat preservation. The building featured a sealed subfloor chamber, accessible only through a hidden trapdoor. Elaborate ventilation systems allowed for precise temperature control in different sections of the building. Most tellingly, drainage channels lined with copper, an expensive material for such a utilitarian purpose, directed fluids to collection vessels rather than away from the building, as would be conventional. Thornwell explained these features to visitors as innovations for aging meat with scientific precision, a claim that his reputation for agricultural innovation made plausible enough to discourage further questioning. Multiple accounts from different sources describe unusual nocturnal activities on Thornwell's property. Abigail Foster's diary entries from 1857 contain repeated references to lights in the fields long after reasonable working hours, and figures moving between the smokehouse and the laboratory building carrying covered containers. Most specifically, she notes Thornwell's habit of applying what he called his special fertilizer only after dark. April 18th, 1857, again tonight, T. And 2 of his servants work the south field by lantern light. They carry the contents of his special barrels in buckets and apply it by hand rather than with conventional spreading tools. The servants wear cloth masks while handling this substance. When the wind shifts in my direction, the smell is unmistakable. Not the usual animal manure, but something metallic and sickly sweet. Whatever grows from soil dressed this way, I would not willingly consume. Perhaps the most telling early warning came from the behavior of Thornwell's enslaved workers. Unlike the common practice on surrounding farms, where enslaved people typically consumed lower quality portions of the same food grown on the property, Thornwell's workers were provided with food purchased from other farms or local markets. This unusual arrangement was ostensibly a punishment, with Thornwell telling neighbors that it reinforced his authority by denying them the superior quality of his own produce. However, accounts from several sources suggest that this practice originated with the workers themselves, who refused to consume anything grown on the property, despite the risk of punishment such defiance would typically incur. Church records document an incident in 1855 when Solomon was discovered bearing food from Thornwell's table rather than eating it. When questioned by the overseer, he reportedly said, "Better hunger than what grows inside after eating master's food." By late 1857, these accumulated oddities had begun to raise serious concerns among a small circle of community members. Dr. Wainwright, whose position gave him unique insight into the unusual medical patterns, began a cautious investigation, limited by his continued dependence on Thornwell's medicinal preparations and his awareness of Thornwell's standing in the community. His approach focused on a scientific documentation rather than direct accusation. He began collecting samples of Thornwell's food products for analysis, comparing symptoms among different households based on their level of consumption, and performing more thorough examinations of deceased patients when permitted by families. Sheriff Mercer's involvement was more complicated. County records show that in January 1858, he began questioning travelers about any unusual observations regarding Thornwell's property. However, these inquiries ceased abruptly in March of the same year, coinciding with a marked increase in his personal visits to Thornwell Farm and acceptance of gift baskets delivered to the sheriff's office. Mercer's widow would later recall, "Josiah changed after he started taking dinner at Thornwell's table. At first he had all these questions, kept notes about the missing travelers. Then suddenly he couldn't praise Thornwell enough. He'd come home full of energy, work through the night, then collapse for days with stomach pain so bad he'd curl up like a child. When I suggested stopping the visits to Thornwell's, he became irrationally angry, said the man was the only thing keeping him alive. The most systematic early investigation came from Abigail Foster, whose property shared a boundary with Thornwell's land and whose bedroom window provided a direct view of his smokehouse and laboratory. A childless widow with independent means, she was perhaps less vulnerable to community pressure than others who harbored suspicions. Her journals document a methodical observation campaign spanning nearly 2 years. She recorded comings and goings, unusual sounds, the timing of Thornwell's fertilizer applications, and correlations between his agricultural activities and community health patterns. She also preserved samples of soil from the boundary between their properties, noting changes in color and composition that coincided with periods of intense activity in Thornwell's smokehouse. Most significantly, Foster attempted to warn newcomers to the community about accepting Thornwell's hospitality, efforts that earned her a reputation for eccentricity and jealousy, effectively undermining her credibility with county officials. The most chilling early indications of Thornwell's true interests, however, come from letters exchanged with his wife, Catherine, during the early years of their marriage. These documents, preserved by Catherine's family in Scotland and only recently connected to the investigation, reveal that his interest in internal cultivation predated his return to Georgia. My dearest Catherine, your father's research into digestive processes has opened doors I scarcely imagined existed. The human vessel contains uncharted territories ripe for cultivation. What if the body itself could be made a garden? Not metaphorically, but literally, a living soil in which to grow substances of remarkable power. Your discomfort is regrettable but necessary. You are the pioneer in a field that will revolutionize human nutrition. When we return to Georgia, you will be celebrated as the mother of a new science. With deepest affection, Elias Catherine's response, dated 3 months before her death, suggests that she had become an unwilling subject in her husband's earliest experiments. Elias, I beg you to extract what you have placed inside me. The movement never ceases now. I cannot sleep. Food brings no nourishment, only sharp pain as it feeds what grows within. Dr. Burton suspects parasites, but I know better. What you call your internal garden is consuming me from within. If you ever truly loved me, end this torment. Your suffering wife, Catherine. The subtle pattern of suspicion surrounding Elias Thornwell would continue to grow throughout 1858, but concrete evidence remained elusive. Those who might have connected the disparate threads of unusual behavior, mysterious disappearances, and medical anomalies were often the same people whose health and judgment were most compromised by their consumption of Thornwell's specially cultivated foods. It would take a more dramatic catalyst to bring the full horror into the light. A catalyst that would arrive in the summer of 1858 in the form of an escaped traveler named James Harrow, whose testimony would provide the first explicit account of what truly happened on Thornwell Farm. In the summer of 1858, a traveler named James Harrow escaped from Thornwell Farm and made it 10 miles to the next county before collapsing. His deathbed testimony, recorded by a local minister and hidden in church archives for over 160 years, describes watching Thornwell harvest something living from inside a man strapped to a table, something that writhed and glistened like a fat white snake. Historical researchers have dismissed this account as fever-induced delusion, until our team connected it with evidence too concrete to deny. Reverend Thomas Blackwell of the neighboring Wilkes County documented Harrow's final confession. The man arrived at my door near midnight, clothes torn and body fevered. He begged sanctuary, claiming a farmer named Thornwell had held him captive for 3 days. Before the doctor could arrive, he insisted on telling his story, fearing he would not survive the night. His account was so grotesque I initially attributed it to delirium, but the precision of certain details and the evident terror in his eyes have haunted me these many years. Harrow described being offered dinner after seeking shelter at Thornwell's farm during a rainstorm. He recalled awakening later in a subfloor chamber beneath the smokehouse, partially paralyzed but conscious. From his position, he could observe Thornwell performing what appeared to be a surgical procedure on another captive, a procedure focused on extracting something from the man's abdominal cavity. The farmer spoke to his victim as a gardener might address his plants, Harrow reported. He explained each step of the harvesting process as if providing instruction. When he extracted the organism, a pale, segmented thing nearly 2 feet in length, He held it up to the lantern light with evident pride before placing it in a specialized container. "This one has matured beautifully," he said. "I believe we can distribute seedlings to the entire county from this specimen alone." Harrow claimed to have escaped when Thornwell left to tend to a disturbance outside, though he appeared to have been partially prepared for the same procedure, with several small incisions in his abdomen that matched marks found on his body by the local doctor. He died hours after delivering his testimony, his internal organs apparently liquefied by what the examining physician described as a caustic substance of unknown origin. Reverend Blackwell sent a sealed letter describing Harrow's testimony to the Crawford County Sheriff, but records show it was received by Thornwell himself, who frequently collected mail for county officials as a courtesy during his trips to town. Solomon's warnings to newcomers, previously dismissed as superstition, gained new significance as our investigation progressed. Fragments of his cautionary statements were preserved in the diaries of several community members. "Don't eat what the master grows. It has teeth inside that bite from within, makes you strong first, then hollows you out for its growing. I've seen what comes out when he harvests. No animal God made looks like that." Church records document Solomon's increasingly desperate attempts to warn the community, despite escalating punishments. By 1858, he had developed a system of subtle signals recognized by other enslaved people in the area. A hand pressed briefly to the stomach when Thornwell offered food at community gatherings, a warning understood by those who had witnessed the consequences of his generosity. Sarah Jenkins, whose great-grandmother was enslaved on a neighboring property, preserved this oral history. "Grandma told us Solomon sacrificed himself to protect others. Said he started eating small amounts of Thornwell's food himself so he could describe the symptoms, give people warning of what to expect. He could feel it growing inside him, but kept working in the fields like nothing was wrong. Said Solomon knew exactly when Thornwell would come to harvest, and that's when he made his escape attempt. Not to get free, but to die beyond Thornwell's reach so nothing could be harvested from him." Letters from Thornwell's deceased wife, Catherine, only partially preserved, provide crucial insight into the origins of his experiments. Beyond her desperate pleas for relief, earlier correspondence reveals her initial scientific interest in her husband's work, before she understood its full implications. Your application of Father's digestive research takes bold steps beyond his cautious theories. The potential for cultivating beneficial organisms within the human intestine is fascinating, though your acceleration of their growth raises concerns. The rabbit specimens show disturbing changes in behavior before death. I worry that larger hosts, even human ones, might face similar outcomes as these organisms mature. Later letters suggest she came to understand that she was not merely documenting her husband's experiments, but had become his primary test subject. "I now recognize the purpose of the specialized diet you've insisted upon these past months. The unusual hunger, followed by the sensation of movement. These are not symptoms of pregnancy as you suggested, but evidence of what you've cultivated within me. I've seen your notes, Elias. I know what you intend to harvest." The Widow Foster's observation journal provides the most comprehensive external documentation of Thornwell's activities. Her methodical records note patterns invisible to less attentive observers. October 12, 1857. "I have correlated T's nocturnal field work with subsequent community illnesses. Fields treated with his special fertilizer yield crops distributed at his harvest dinners. 2 weeks after consumption, recipients experience a week of unusual vitality, followed by complaints of abdominal discomfort. Approximately 1 month later, T visits these households at night, ostensibly to deliver medicinal preparations. The following day, recipients appear weakened but report feeling cleansed. This cycle has repeated 3 times since spring. Most chillingly, Foster recorded sounds from Thornwell's smokehouse that led her to believe the processing of his specialized meat involves still living subjects. The sounds emerge in a pattern, first the muffled cries, then silence suggesting administration of his chloroform, which I have observed him purchasing in quantities no farmer would require, followed by a wet, slithering noise accompanied by his voice. Always speaking in the gentle tones of encouragement one uses with children or plants. Then comes the sound I cannot adequately describe, a high, thin scraping that raises the hair on my neck and sends my cats into hiding. The most disturbing pages of Thornwell's journal, which we've had authenticated by 3 independent historical document experts, contain detailed illustrations of what he called his special crop, parasitic organisms cultivated to grow inside human hosts, feeding on their internal organs while simultaneously enhancing their physical vitality, creating a symbiotic relationship that he could harvest repeatedly until the host was depleted. What follows is information that was deliberately erased from county records and history books. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Thornwell's agricultural system evolved significantly during his decade of experimentation. His earliest attempts, documented in journals dated 1846 to 1848, focused on modifying existing intestinal parasites to enhance rather than diminish their host's nutrient absorption. Notes from this period show frustration with conventional parasites' limitations. Common parasitic specimens inevitably damage their host beyond recovery. This represents flawed design. A truly superior organism would sustain its host while allowing for partial harvesting of itself, a perpetual crop rather than a single harvest relationship. By 1850, Thornwell had progressed to creating hybridized organisms, combining characteristics of several parasitic species with modifications of his own design. He documented successful cultivation of these organisms in livestock before transitioning to human subjects, beginning with travelers unlikely to be missed. Subject 4 demonstrates remarkable adaptation to the seeded organism. Initial cultivar has developed secondary branching throughout the lower intestinal tract, with nutrient-rich nodules forming at 6-inch intervals. First partial harvest successful, extracted 3 nodules while leaving primary structure intact. Subject's recovery was uncomfortable but complete within 4 days. Anticipate second harvest of superior quality in approximately 14 days. Thornwell's methodology became increasingly sophisticated with each generation of his parasitic crop. By 1855, he had developed a 3-stage process. First, seeding potential hosts through specially prepared food containing larval forms of his parasites. These initial organisms were designed to cause minimal discomfort while establishing themselves in the digestive tract. Second, cultivation through a specialized diet that nourished both host and parasite, creating the temporary enhancement of vitality many community members experienced after beginning to consume Thornwell's food regularly. Finally, harvesting the matured parasites, a process that initially required crude surgical intervention, but eventually evolved into a method using specialized compounds that would cause the organisms to partially detach from the intestinal walls, allowing for extraction through induced vomiting or controlled purgation. The most horrifying aspect of Thornwell's system was its self-perpetuating nature. The harvested parasites provided both the seed stock for new hosts and the base material for his medicinal preparations, which contained processed extracts of the organisms that temporarily relieved the symptoms they themselves had caused. Dr. Rebecca Chen, parasitologist consulted during our investigation, explains, what Thornwell appears to have created was a modified tapeworm variant with unusual properties, the ability to form nutrient-rich nodules that could be harvested without killing the primary organism, a symbiotic relationship with the host that initially enhanced rather than depleted their health, and most disturbingly, a reproductive cycle that allowed seeding of new hosts through prepared food products. If these descriptions are accurate, he essentially created a human farm where the crop grew inside the people themselves. Thornwell's journals document his meticulous categorization of hosts based on their ability to sustain his parasitic crop. Young adults provide the most robust environment for primary cultivation, though their awareness of bodily changes makes them more likely to seek medical intervention before full maturation. Older hosts show less dramatic vitality response, but rarely question subsequent symptoms, attributing them to age. Children yield the most vigorous specimens, but in smaller quantities. For optimal yield, a distribution across age groups allows for staggered harvesting throughout the season. The processing facility Thornwell created in his modified smokehouse served both to prepare harvested parasites for various uses and to process the remains of hosts who had been fully depleted. When a vessel can no longer sustain cultivation, it maintains one final utility. The meat, properly prepared, carries traces of the organism that enhance flavor and tenderness while serving as a preliminary introduction into new hosts. Nothing is wasted in nature's perfect cycle. This explanation accounts for both the unusual qualities of Thornwell's meat products, noted by community members, and the disturbing pattern of disappearances in the area. Travelers and occasionally local residents, whose absence could be plausibly explained and whose bodies became part of his special preserves distributed throughout the community. The most grotesque revelation came from Thornwell's detailed records of his feeding program, the systematic distribution of his parasitic organisms throughout the community through strategic donations. The harvest cycle is now self-sustaining. Primary hosts, sheriff, minister, physician, three prominent families, receive regular harvesting visits disguised as medical treatments. Their influential positions prevent questions about their occasional illnesses. Secondary hosts, recipients of charitable food baskets, provide supplemental harvest material and testing ground for new cultivars. Community feasts introduce preliminary exposure to all residents, creating receptivity to subsequent seeding through preserved food gifts. When lightning struck Thornwell Farm in August 1859, the resulting fire revealed what lay beneath the smokehouse floor, a chamber containing dozens of still-living victims in various stages of cultivation, some of whom had been missing for years, their bodies now serving as living incubators for Thornwell's parasitic crop. The truth of what happened next has been systematically removed from every official record, but we've pieced it together from family diaries, private correspondence, and the reluctant testimony of descendants who still bear the physical markers of their ancestors' consumption. The discovery began with a summer storm of unusual intensity. Lightning struck the Thornwell smokehouse around midnight on August 17, 1859, igniting stored materials that burned with unnatural colors and released acrid smoke that sickened those who inhaled it. Joseph Mercer, the sheriff's 16-year-old son who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, was among the volunteer firefighters. In the confusion, he entered the burning structure searching for Thornwell, who was believed to be inside. Instead, he discovered the hidden chamber beneath the smokehouse floor. William Cooper, whose grandfather was among those who entered the chamber, preserved this account. Granddad wouldn't speak of what they found until he was dying. Said there were people, or what had been people, arranged in rows like crops in a field. Some were recent captives, fully conscious and begging for help. Others had been there so long they no longer seemed fully human, their abdomens distended to impossible size, their skin translucent enough to see movement beneath. And the smell, he said it haunted him all his life, like a slaughterhouse and a garden hothouse mixed together. Sheriff Mercer himself was found in the chamber, apparently in the midst of receiving a treatment when the fire broke out. Thornwell had fled, but the evidence of his activities was undeniable. The townspeople, many of whom had been unknowing participants in his system for years, reacted with predictable horror. The community's response was swift and merciless. A search party tracked Thornwell to a cave 6 miles from his property, where he had apparently prepared a contingency shelter stocked with specialized equipment and journals documenting his work. No official record exists of what happened to Elias Thornwell. County death records list him as deceased by misadventure during forest fire, but private accounts tell a different story. The search party returned with his journals, but not his body. One member's diary suggests a form of justice that echoed Thornwell's own methods. What was done today must never be spoken of. We ensured T would never again use human vessels for his ungodly cultivation. The method chosen held a certain symmetry that Pastor William suggested was divinely inspired. May God forgive what necessity compelled us to do. The aftermath brought a different kind of horror, the realization of what community members had been consuming and what might still be growing inside them. Dr. Wainwright, though himself compromised by years of consuming Thornwell's food, attempted to develop treatments. We have burned the remaining parasitic specimens and all associated documentation, except what I require for developing countermeasures. Those most severely affected are being treated with a regimen of specific herbal purgatives and dietary restrictions. Many will not survive the extraction process, but death is preferable to continued cultivation of these abominations within their bodies. County officials, many of whom had been Thornwell's primary hosts, orchestrated a comprehensive suppression of the incident. Official records attributed the deaths that followed to a cholera outbreak, a convenient explanation for the painful debilitating symptoms experienced by those undergoing treatment for parasitic infection. Thornwell's farm was burned to the ground, his fields salted to prevent anything from growing there again. His journals were supposedly destroyed, though our discovery proves at least one volume survived, hidden, perhaps, by someone who believed the truth should not be entirely erased. The most effective tool of suppression, however, was the community's own shame and horror. No one wanted to acknowledge their unwitting participation in Thornwell's system. The meals they had enjoyed, the preserved meats they had praised, the neighbors whose disappearances they had failed to question. Within a generation, the explicit details had been transmuted into vague warnings and superstitions. Never eat what a too prosperous farmer gives freely. Watch how a man keeps his hands, not his fields. If meat tastes sweeter than it should, spit it out and bury what remains. Economic interest reinforced this collective amnesia. Crawford County, struggling to recover from both the Thornwell incident and the subsequent Civil War, could not afford the reputation of being the place where a farmer had fed human-cultivated parasites to his neighbors. Local historians deliberately omitted the incident from county records, and state histories focused on the county's contributions to the Confederate cause rather than its darkest chapter. Yet the physical legacy persisted. Medical records from the region document an unusually high incidence of digestive disorders for generations after the incident. Genetic studies of current residents reveal anomalies in intestinal flora that cannot be explained by conventional science, suggesting that traces of Thornwell's special crop may have become integrated into the microbiome of descendant families. As we conclude this dark chapter of American history, we are left to contemplate the terrible intimacy of consumption, how what we take into our bodies becomes us, and how easily trust can be perverted when we break bread together. The story of Elias Thornwell reminds us that history buries its most disturbing chapters, not through denial, but through transformation into folklore and superstition. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that Thornwell's agricultural vision, the cultivation of living things within human hosts for harvesting and consumption, was not as far removed from the cultural context of his time as we might wish to believe. In a society built upon the exploitation of human bodies for economic gain, his methods represented not a departure from, but an extension of existing systems, pushed to their most grotesque conclusion. As you leave this video, we ask you to consider what other horrors might be hiding behind the quaint traditions and forgotten warnings we no longer heed. How many other Thornwells lurk in the shadows of American history, their atrocities transformed into ghost stories and cautionary tales, while the actual evidence of their crimes remains buried in archived journals, sealed records, and the modified bodies of their unknowing victims? Some chapters of history are buried not because they never happened, but because we cannot bear to acknowledge the hunger that lives within us all.